Opus Magnum is beautiful in a way that menu-heavy experiences rarely are. Cozy nocturnal cityscapes are rendered in a soft style with warm splashes of colour, setting up a perfectly relaxed atmosphere for some gentle problem solving. Painterly character portraits are grounded with a dash of flair, reinforcing the theme of alchemy as a stylish alternative to the stuffy science of our own world. Menus are coated in appropriately opulent textures with some subtle shading, giving them just enough physical presence without being distracting or gaudy. Best of all are the alchemical symbols, which have an innate cool factor by their sheer novelty. They're the kind of thing you might have seen in passing but are still largely alien, not a part of everyday life. You could say that Zachtronics were handed a graphic design freebie by the alchemists of old, but they deserve credit for seizing the opportunity with both manipulators, tastefully incorporating them into menu borders and otherwise dead space. All in all, what you get with Opus Magnum is a game that's nice to look at, which is a good thing because, as we all know by now, part of the appeal of these games is just watching them. Visually, the action bears a relatively strong likeness to Space Chem, but its lineage dates back to the Codex of Alchemical Engineering, a Flash game released even earlier. The most immediate difference is the lovingly rendered hexagonal tabletop where the action transpires. Square grids have dominated Zachtronics' previous games to the point where the hex layout of Opus is one of its biggest departures. While this might be initially disorientating and seem like an effort to overcomplicate things, it's actually the best possible choice for a game of this style. It's telling that tracks and pistons happen to be more expensive than standard arms when they're the only way of moving objects laterally. Instead, Opus is largely about rotation. If mathematicians are to be believed, there are only 3 regular ways a 2D plane can be tiled: by triangles, by squares, or by hexagons. With that in mind, the best layout for a game revolving around circular movement is hexagonal, since it most closely matches the arcs you're expected to work with. Naturally, it's not a perfect overlap, but it's a lot easier to predict which tiles will trigger collisions when compared to a square grid. If you doubt how important this is, it's worth going back to play Codex for comparison. Apart from that, Opus shares much in common with its predecessor. Rather than try to retrofit the mechanics of Codex into the mold of later games, where puzzles were often a meticulous, drawn-out procedure, efficient solutions usually look more like simple, elegant clockwork. The abundance of moving parts performing short, repetitive actions is almost as hypnotic as my voice. Wake up. Of course, it helps that, incredibly, this is the first Zachtronics game which allows you to run your solutions indefinitely. Not only does this mean you can vainly watch your creation uninterrupted, it also serves as a way of verifying that your solution is truly infinite. Granted, that's not particularly useful for Opus Magnum, but it's a feature worth preserving going forward, much like the new Ghost Piece toggle, which would have been a huge time saver in Infinifactory. Even so, as entrancing as these machines can be, their unique appeal comes at a cost. Arms can only behave unconditionally. Technically, you can create a rudimentary form of conditional execution by designing arms that grab and move whether there's an atom present or not. This behaviour once again led to a brainfuck interpreter in what's fast becoming a tradition. Still, in terms of practical application, these techniques are rarely utilised outside of low instruction count solutions. Actual puzzles all feature unchanging inputs and are intended to be solved with simple looping mechanisms. Similar to Shenzhen's fixed speed visualizations, this could be seen as a critical flaw, particularly for people who are familiar with Zachtronics' previous games, but a more charitable view is that it carves its own niche among a rapidly growing library of similar titles. If it becomes part of a greater trend towards simplification, then it's something to lament, but Zachtronics seem more than willing to wobble back and forth on making more or less challenging games depending on what suits. Difficulty can't escalate forever, especially not from the studio that already brought us Space Chem and Shenzhen. That said, the infinite grid provided in the main campaign is an extreme swing of the pendulum. Inputs and manipulators block tiles, which can be a minor hassle, but with an abundance of space, an endless instruction tray, and no limit on glyphs or mechanisms, there's practically zero obstacles in your way. Even the most stupid, slow, wasteful solution will get the job done eventually. This dissolves a classic Zachtronics form of motivation and reward, the feeling of seeing an intimidating new challenge, being unsure whether you can actually beat it or not, then feeling all the better afterwards as a result. Obviously, every puzzle in the previous games was solvable, but the constraints decided how many people would move on to the next round. Until you saw a solution through to the end, you never knew if this would be your turn to drop out. Opus has no such filter. If you can get past the tutorial, you basically have the skills to make it all the way to the end. It's just a matter of persistence. Good news if you really want to tick every box, but bad news if you're looking to be surprised by your own intelligence. Of course, this was a common observation while the game was still in development, so the response was to introduce constrained spaces for the bonus campaign. It's a welcome addition, but relatively brief and simplistic. Whereas SpaceChem's production levels often had between 4 to 6 reactors, Opus tops out at just 3 chambers. Strictly speaking, the raw number of compartments doesn't determine a puzzle's complexity. Omega pseudoethene is a testament to that fact. Still, the ability to place a larger number of reactors and more freely determine the relationship between them lent SpaceChem a planning element which is somewhat lacking in Opus. In an unfortunate twist, it's as though Opus goes from being too freeform to too restrictive. Conduits only allow 1 or 2 atoms at a time, and tight spacing rules out chambers for certain tasks. In this example, the leftmost section with just 7 tiles doesn't have enough space to assemble the products, so it can only really be used for one of 2 things. Either you place the reagent there for calcification and unbonding, or you place the glyph of animismus there and pass the results back. There are better and worse choices to make, but the possibility space is pretty small by Zachtronics standards, so much so that it skirts dangerously close to the developer logic trap I outlined in the past. Thankfully, the drastically reduced difficulty of Opus comes with a silver lining. In previous games, many of the later challenges were such a massive undertaking they weren't all that appealing to optimize. This is the kind of thing that'll vary based on your aptitude and passion for each game, but there's definitely at least some trade-off between puzzle complexity and a player's willingness to go back for optimization. After somehow clawing my way past Kelp Harvesting Robot in Shenzhen IO, the idea of ever restarting it from scratch is laughable. Since Opus is considerably easier, it widens that window. Even if many people still don't see it all the way through to the end, the portion of puzzles they'll comfortably solve will be higher. This really sums up Opus's position in the Zachtronics catalogue. It's full of optimization challenges, but only optimization is challenging, at least compared to the previous ones. Of course that has its downsides, but it also sounds more damning than it is, because the thrill of completing a difficult puzzle can only really ever be felt once. By contrast, optimization is the gift that keeps on giving. If you took a liking to the previous games, it's entirely possible you spent the majority of your time optimizing puzzles you'd already solved anyway. At that point, it doesn't really matter whether the problem is difficult to solve, only whether it's enjoyable to optimize. Given this focus on optimization, it's worth putting under even closer scrutiny this time around. Normally I'd advocate for a larger number of required outputs since that encourages the most robust solutions, but in this case the small 6 product requirement makes more sense. Thanks to the endless instruction tray, initialization steps can be performed at the start and then a loop created which is just copy-pasted 6 times to pass the verification. For example, you might permanently place one atom on a glyph of duplication to copy it more quickly. This could be made more hassle-some by increasing the required number of outputs, but as long as the instruction tray remains large enough, it would always be possible to code the actions for every product individually, and if it's possible, no matter how tedious, someone will do it. Only requiring 6 products could be seen as encouraging these types of solutions since it makes them less tedious to create, but actually it has the opposite effect. For initialization steps to be valuable, they have to shave off more cycles than they cost. If setup takes 12 cycles and you have to make 12 products, the initialization only needs to save 1 cycle per product to break even. On the other hand, if you only need 6 products, that same initialization has to provide a benefit of 2 cycles per product to break even. The results speak for themselves. Crafting a low cycle solution for most, if not all, puzzles is better done without any setup. This preserves the focus on looping machines, while still allowing for an endless instruction tray, which falls in line with Opus's presumed design goal of removing as many arbitrary barriers as possible. Even so, a classic optimization problem has slipped through the cracks thanks to the addition of polymers. The final step of these puzzles is always to bond the latest unit to the end of the chain, which means at least one atom gets left over the bonder pad instead of being counted. For the best score, it's necessary to immediately move the item over the output zone once it's long enough to register as the final product. Getting this to work often requires either an extra arm or a hard-coded final step from the last arm in the sequence. Similar to how giant rotating arms could be used on certain Infinifactory stages, the point is to slam the last product into place as quickly as possible, even though that only matters because we're counting a finite number in the first place. The same argumentation applies as before. You could choose to preserve your perfect looping machine by refusing to use this technique, but you'll be competing against it on the histogram and worse, the new top percentile indicator. Players have always been free to decide for themselves what sort of solutions to strive for. Some of my favourite creations are ones that don't top out any graph but rather balance them to form something elegant. Other self-imposed restrictions can lead to new designs as well, like creating an object without unnecessary waste, or solving a production alchemy stage without pistons. If you're willing to ignore the graphs and leaderboards, there are plenty of these self-imposed challenges to be found in Opus. Still, histograms and top percentiles exist as an incentive, and as such that puts at least some onus on the developer to ensure that chasing higher scores is also fairly enjoyable. To this end, some puzzles have interesting complications thrown into the mix. Airship fuel is made of 4 atoms, but you're given 3 inputs, making it easy to solve, but much more challenging to optimize. These kinds of quirks are scattered throughout the campaign, but they're fighting an uphill battle because what hurts optimization most of all is what hurts this game in general, its simplicity. Removing conditional execution and arbitrary barriers is one thing, but even if you did the same to SpaceChem, much of its complexity would remain intact. Tight loops would still be rewarded, so waldos would still be folding in on themselves in difficult, creative ways. In a sense, Opus shares more in common with Infinifactory, as they both are more like a traditional assembly line where products are pushed through, undergoing one change at a time. Even though Infinifactory had by far the most spacious Zachtronics stages until Opus came along, it could sometimes be difficult to accomplish tasks because every factory block occupied space, and let's not forget there was another dimension to consider. Both of these things are lacking in Opus. Although there's plenty of glyphs to work with, many can be summarized as depositing a reagent to receive a new atom. The biggest difference between them is their shape, which does matter, but it's not enough to stop the process from feeling repetitive, something previous games had done a great job of avoiding. More than ever, this game is about moving stuff around efficiently. There's a simple pleasure in that, but not enough to sustain the number of puzzles on offer. Assuming Zachtronics were fully committed to this simplicity in spite of its downsides, one way Opus could have deepened its appeal is by adding more optimization goals instead. With no limit on instruction count, low cost and low area metrics favour using as few arms as possible. There's always bound to be some overlap between different score criteria. For example, low instruction count solutions in TIS will probably also use a small number of nodes. This overlap has never been stronger than in Opus Magnum though. Every component placed increases both area and cost, so if, for example, something has to be bonded, the best choice for both area and cost is to have just one bonder. These decisions get more nuanced as you start creating larger molecules, since glyphs can be placed on tiles that would end up being occupied anyway, requiring no extra space, but the correlation between the two scores remains fairly strong. Now, it's clear that Opus isn't any worse for including these 3 categories, but that's exactly the point I'm driving at. All 5 of these games have had 3 metrics each, and this feels like maybe the only area where Zachtronics have gone on autopilot instead of reconsidering their choices. Since the bonus campaign takes place under harsh area constraints anyway, it replaces area with an instruction count metric, but there's no reason why we can't have both. If you try it out, you'll see that optimizing for instructions is actually pretty compelling, especially in the main campaign where that metric isn't even available. This focus on a completely different aspect of the mechanics results in totally unique solutions compared to either cycles, cost, or area. Taking some inspiration from Shenzhen, there's even a 5th criteria which would result in another branch of designs: power. If each instruction which actually got executed counted as 1 power, it would favour solutions with low instruction counts but high throughput. Add in a 6th metric of some kind and there could even be an appropriately hexagonal spiderweb graph of each solution. Increasing the number of histograms would come with pros and cons. One downside is that each player is more likely to be behind the curve on several graphs, which can be demoralising. The newly introduced Hermit mode allows players to opt out of histograms if this is happening to them, but of course that relies on them to self-regulate their experience. Even with this option, it's understandable Zachtronics would still have this concern in mind, but looking at it another way, increasing the number of goals means that each player is more likely to be ahead of the curve on the particular metric they care about most. If you only ever optimize for cycles, you drag the area and cost scores down, which allows other players to beat the average on those more easily. As long as you recognise that you can only ever truly optimise for one thing at a time, including more graphs actually makes the game seem kinder, since a smaller fraction of players will care about each metric. Crucially, each one has the potential to add a huge amount of meaningful content to the game. Start playing with instruction count in mind and all of a sudden you've essentially added 50 new puzzles to the main campaign. Yes, some of those puzzles will be better than others, but this kind of return on investment doesn't come around often in game design. It's a step well worth taking. Perhaps one reason these instruction-related metrics are relegated to the bonus campaign is because they seem completely irrelevant to alchemists, but that's something which could have been addressed by the narrative. Cost is measured in G anyway, which, assuming it stands for gold, is pretty questionable in a world where lead into gold is trivial. I have some more thoughts on that, but let's not dwell on a fictional economy, as tempting as that might be. Let's also not dwell long on Sigmar's Garden either. In my experience, this one is much easier to win than Shenzhen Solitaire, which sort of leads to me absent-mindedly clicking on matching pairs until a problem presents itself. As a standalone game, it may not be as compelling as Solitaire, but it's arguably a better relaxation tool, which is its more important function, all things considered. It's sort of like virtual bubble wrap, where if you're willing to put in some mental effort now and then, you can make it all the way to the end. Clearing the board and clicking that final gold is as cathartic as it needs to be. Rewarding players with additional dialogue for playing more games is a nice touch, although if you think about it, it does sort of spoil the fact that Anateus and Concordia will be together all the way through. This transition to a fixed protagonist was arguably an unwise move. Who the main character is has never been particularly important, where the previous game shined was at the intersection of puzzles and narrative. Opus has at least one such instance of its own. You're never told that destroying Vitae atoms is wrong, but you feel it nonetheless. As we can see from previous Zachtronics games, a fixed protagonist isn't necessary to achieve these kinds of moments. If anything, it runs the risk of getting in the way. Still, even though it's possible they stood to lose more than gain by writing Anateus as a fully fledged character, they've pulled it off anyway thanks to some charming dialogue. There's a stiff Victorian English quality to the writing which is played well for comedy. The plot itself is pretty predictable, but it's an intriguing world, just detailed enough to get the big picture without ruining the mystique. Nowhere are the benefits of a narrative more clear than the Journal of Alchemical Engineering, which lacks one. For some players this will barely make a difference, but for others it could be a key factor in whether they bother completing these puzzles or not. Regardless, this kind of structure brings its own benefits. Community creations can stress the mechanics in ways the developers didn't catch, and the opportunity to have a puzzle included in the journal encourages that community to focus on concepts which fit the theme. Successful entrants get a sense of pride at their problems being bundled into an official patch, and the developers benefit from others doing some of the work. Although it's worth pointing out that making a polished custom puzzle creator is probably a significant effort in and of itself. It's nice to see this feature return after a long absence, and its inclusion really cements Opus as strangely one of the most straightforward Zachtronics games, but also one of the most fully realised. If we were to create an alchemical diagram of the Zachtronics games themselves, Opus Magnum would probably sit opposite Space Chem. Puzzle games almost never look this good, they rarely sound this good, and a lot of them don't even have a story, let alone one which ties into the puzzles themselves. Gradual refinements have continued to accumulate, like the unlimited number of save files inherited from Shenzhen, alongside Hermit Mode, top percentiles and the Ghost Piece. For the first time, it's the core mechanics that feel lacking. On the one hand, Opus stands out from the others thanks to its simplicity and lower difficulty. To an extent, these are good things, because now if you're in the mood for optimization, you have more puzzles than ever to tackle. As someone who played 5 back-to-back for this review series, Opus felt analogous to Sigmar's Garden in the grand scheme of things. It's the Zachtronics game you can play in the middle of playing the others without mentally exhausting yourself. That said, there's a serious lack of depth. Not only does it have fewer mechanics than the other games, but the ones that do exist often can't be creatively combined like they could before. Although it gets everything else right, that deficiency is a serious mark against it. All in all, it may not be the gold standard, but it's not a lead balloon either. 5 games later, whether you want to call them sequels or not, Zachtronics have shown themselves capable of building a series which serves a niche without feeling redundant. It can't be overstated what a brilliant balancing act these games have done at staying true to their core appeal, while also accenting certain parts each time so as to provide a fresh experience. Basically, if you enjoy any of them, each one will more or less appeal to you, and depending on what you like most about them, each one will appeal to you a little more or less. It remains to be seen how much further these concepts can be pushed, but even if it was to end here, it's a greater catalogue than some will ever have. Zachtronics deserve to be celebrated for being not only one of the few developers to spearhead a unique subgenre, but to then set about exploring that genre as thoroughly as they can. Even if you have no interest in these titles, there's a lesson to be gleaned here about the potential of recognizing what works, but also refining and reinventing within that framework. Although, if you played these games, that's probably something you learned already.